The beginning of the climate realization came from a fitting spokesman. An up-and-coming NASA researcher, the late 1960s saw now Dr. James Hansen working under Iowa physicist James Van Allen, an architect of NASA's early instrumentation. They were focused on an important question. Was Venus's high microwave radiation due to an ionosphere, or is it just extremely hot? In 1970, the Soviet Venera spacecraft issued a retrospectively sobering reality. Venus had an average temperature of almost 482 degrees Celsius. In the months following, Allen and Hansen were tasked with understanding why. Following a successful satellite launch led by Hansen, smog was discovered on the planet. A now familiar explanation was offered. Carbon dioxide was insulating the planet and functioning as a planetary greenhouse. Venus is not alone in experiencing this effect. Having known Earth's atmosphere is changing in composition, particularly in carbon dioxide, Hansen now turned to studying the atmosphere on our home planet. In 1981, he and a team of scientists published an article in the Science magazine stating that the 0.4 degrees Celsius increase seen in the recent century is consistent with that of carbon dioxide-induced warming. They asserted that the 21st century would see shifting climate zones, the creation of drought-prone regions in North America and Asia, erosion of ice sheets, and opening of the fabled Northwest Passage. These predictions have since come true or are well underway. The science was there. Now it was just up to an implementation and policy to correct the man-made issue. In a democratic society, the path to make change is through public awareness, so that is what James Hansen turned to. In June of 1988, he sat before the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources and told the nation, unequivocally, that global warming was no longer a theory. It was happening. In the midst of a fittingly record-breaking DC heat wave, Hansen testified that the likelihood the planet's warming was due to natural variation was less than 1%. His testimony marked a turning point. For the first time, climate change was not just the domain of academic journals, but a matter of national concern. He had done his duty. The facts were discovered, and they were out. The policy remained unchanged. Despite the clarity and urgency of the science, his warning was met with inertia. Politicians nodded solemnly, the press ran headlines, and then the news cycle moved on. Behind the scenes, the gears of censorship had already begun to turn. As early as the Bush administration, directives came down the chain instructing NASA scientists to soften their statements, or in some cases, remain silent altogether. His projections, published in 1988 using one of the first comprehensive climate models, proved disturbingly accurate. The heat waves, the shifting climate zones, the melting ice sheets, they all unfolded on schedule. Yet rather than drive immediate change, his findings became just another front in a growing political culture war. Government officials rewrote press releases and blocked interviews. NASA's mission statement was shifted, no longer pledging to, quote, protect our home planet, but instead to pioneer the future in space exploration. Climate, inconveniently, had become too political. The visible denialism, though shocking to some, had not come without precedent. When evidence mounted in the 1950s and 60s that smoking causes lung cancer, tobacco companies didn't try to disprove it outright. Instead, they funded, quote, independent research to raise questions, employed PR firms to muddy the waters, and elevated a handful of contrarian scientists to create the illusion of a debate. The goal was not to win on facts, but to delay regulation by manufacturing doubt. With billions of dollars in profit at stake, fossil fuel companies and allied think tanks poured resources into creating such uncertainty. They funded fringe researchers who would challenge consensus, no matter how weak their arguments. These scientists, many of whom were not climate experts, were presented to the public as equals to mainstream climatologists. In debates, on television, and in congressional hearings, they framed global warming as an open question, even as peer-reviewed data said otherwise. And so, a moment that could have marked the start of global action instead marked the beginning of a decades-long stall. Refusing to retreat into the safety of academia, Hansen instead embraced the tools of democracy. He spoke out publicly, granted interviews, wrote op-eds, and gave congressional testimonies, using his position not only as a scientist but as a citizen trying to alert the public. In doing so, Hansen stepped into a role rarely taken by government-employed researchers, that of an activist. He used the visibility of his government affiliation to bring credibility, but also took risks by defying orders to stay quiet. In 2006, he publicly accused the Bush administration of censoring climate science, an act of civil disobedience that reignited public discourse and earned media attention nationwide. In 2011, at the age of 70, he was arrested in front of the White House during a protest against the Keystone XL pipeline. His presence alongside grassroots organizers sent a powerful message. Scientific authority and citizen activism could work in tandem. Through these actions, Hansen showed how civil society and individuals could collaborate within a democratic system to pressure decision-makers. Though he had never held elected office, his repeated testimonies before Congress and direct communication with presidents shaped environmental platforms in elections and inspired a generation of climate voters. While the policy outcomes of his efforts were limited in the short term, Hansen's impact on public consciousness was profound. His early use of democratic rights laid the foundation for today's climate movement. From Greta Thunberg's school strikes to the Sunrise Movement's legislative advocacy, many of today's climate activists cite Hansen as a key influence. Democracy gave Hansen the platform to speak. It gives us the same platform to vote, to march, to demand better. Climate change is now not a question of science, but a question of collective will.